So welcome everyone again to this virtual roundtable called Collaborative Research Do's and Don'ts. We just did a little round of introductions and we're now moving into the main event. My name is Peter Andrée. I'm a professor in political science at Carleton University and director of the Carleton Center for Community Innovation, or 3CI. So today's virtual roundtable is co-sponsored with A Safe and Affordable Place to Call Home, which is a project co-funded by SSHRC and CMHC. We have two speakers today and two discussants, and I'll introduce each one at a time and then invite them to provide a few minutes of opening remarks, and then we'll move into a discussion round during which we invite questions and comments from everybody who's here today. And towards the end of the virtual roundtable, I'll put a link into an evaluation survey where I invite you to give your feedback on what you thought of today's virtual roundtable. And also it's a chance for you to suggest other speakers or topics that you'd like to see covered in future events like this. We plan to do at least another one of these in February and again later next spring. And before we get started, I just want to give one comment on scope. So the collaborative research that we're talking about today is typically between university researchers and community partners, sometimes community researchers, and it can take many forms. In all cases, it involves developing a shared vision for the work, building trust and reciprocal knowledge exchange. In Indigenous contexts, some particular protocols and principles come into play, such as data sovereignty. And all of these forms of collaborative research are up for discussion today, recognizing that they might look different in specific contexts with different partners and with different goals or priorities. And so we invite you to kind of think broadly about collaborative research. So to get us started here, I'll first ask Sarah Buhler to give some comments. She's from the College of Law faculty at the University of Saskatchewan. Sarah is the daughter of Jake and Louise, and mom of Simon, Ben, and Rachel, and the spouse of Charlie. Her grandparents and great-grandparents were Mennonite farmers who came as refugees and settlers from what is now Ukraine to Treaty 6 territory just north of Saskatoon. I have more in Sarah's bio, but I think I'll just pass it on to Sarah and invite her to kind of open things up. So thanks so much for joining us, Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to share just a couple of thoughts. I know some of the faces on the screens and the names on the screen, but I was particularly excited to see one of my very close community collaborators, Chantel Johnson, is in the room, and so I have to give Chantel credit. A lot of what I'm sharing, I have a little slide with some comments, and a lot of these ideas have been developed through my experience working with a legal clinic in Saskatoon called a classic community legal assistance services for Saskatoon Inner City, and Chantel, who is my dear friend and colleague, is the director of that community-based legal clinic. So I'm hoping maybe that she'll give some feedback later during the discussion as well, if there's time. So I'm going to share my screen. So I was asked, it's do's and don'ts, which I'm not going to. I'm just learning along the way, but I've had a couple of things that I've found that have been useful along the way, and so I'm going to share my screen and share my slides. Can everyone see the screen right now? It's a one-page slideshow here, and I thought I would just go through these. I have about 5 minutes. So these are, and I just got back from a trip to Europe. Actually, I was in the Netherlands doing some research work there, and so I didn't have a lot of time to put this together. This is just kind of like as I was, sitting on the plane on the way home, thinking through sort of what some of the do's and don'ts from my experience. So the first one, and I think, I have learned, especially from elders and, senior knowledgeable people in the community, that one of the best things to do is to always start with knowing who you are. I think often researchers are focused on, trying to learn about everybody else in research, but it's really important to know who you are and reflect on your positionality in everything that you do. And so that's why in my bio, I tried to start with positioning myself. I am a settler. I am the granddaughter of people who came to Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. They came as refugees, but at the same time became beneficiaries of the settler colonial project. They got land, they got to farm, all during the time when many Indigenous people were being displaced from land, being, my grandparents and great-grandparents had freedom of religion, all of these different things. And it's part of that history is why I myself have always had housing security, and why I'm in the place that I am. And it means that I don't understand a lot, and I have a lot to learn about other stories and other positions. So that's really important. My second point is that it's really important, and I know that this is it's always said, but it's so important to take time to build relationships. But I've also found that it's important to go further. Relationship is it's not, transactional. It's really important to create relationships that are also friendships with community partners. And I have some of my best friendships are with the people that I work with in community, and that. That's something that really matters and that really helps develop meaningful research relationships. That means having coffee and getting lunch and getting to know people and build those relationships. I've also found that it's important to, I guess it is, to not take that transactional approach that I know some research takes, to their work, but to actually try to understand what it is that you might be able to contribute to the work that your partner is doing that's maybe unrelated to the research relationship. But whether there's, fundraising events that you can show up to, you can help with, or other community events that are happening that really help you build understanding, relationships, and that's something to be looking for. There's so much hospitality and so much generosity in communities, and to be open to that is it's so important. I always try to think about accountability, thinking about who you are accountable to. I think researchers often think about, your institution. You have accountabilities to your funders, your institution, but thinking really deeply about accountability to community partner, and what that means, and what this requires of you is something that's important to do. And related to that, think a lot about ethics. My motto is you can never be too ethical. And that really means, thinking deeply, not just about what university research ethics boards require, but that's important, but also what are the research ethics that your community partner requires, and what does that mean? Who do you need to talk to? What do you need to learn about that? The next one is, and this is something that Chantal and I have spoken a lot about, be mindful of your collaborators' time. Community organizations and community partners are incredibly busy. They do not have time for many of the sort of like logistical things that come up with research projects. So So that's something that you can think strategically about and think about, one thing that I know Chantal, and maybe she can speak to this as well, but one of the things that often, if community partners need to do like letters of support, like that kind of thing, it's really helpful. This is just a little example, but thinking about, could you write the letter and then just ask them to look at it and see if they want to edit it and sign it. Like there's things that you can be efficient about, knowing that community partners are incredibly busy doing incredibly important work. And this is my I don't know if I phrased this right, but be humble, but try not to be annoying. And what I mean by that is I have seen, and I think I have been that person who is so concerned about, doing the right thing and, making sure that, I'm, following all the right steps with community-based research, that I end up sort of have ended up kind of centering myself and my need to be, a great community partner, which ends up, it can actually ironically end up being kind of taking up a bunch of time for your community partners. I once got some great advice from a community partner and a dear friend who he because I was talking about like, well, how can I make sure that this is ethical and and he just said, you know what, Sarah, this isn't about you. Let's just like do the work. And I found that was incredibly helpful feedback to make it less about me, more about the work, and carry on from there. And that's related to the next which is, and I think Peter spoke to this, identify a shared vision and goal and work with your collaborators toward that shared vision or goal. Is your goal, housing justice in the community? And then how is your research project focusing on that, and like, what does that require? And I think that can create that shared vision and energy towards something. And then my last, but definitely not least, this work is often, it's about heavy stuff, injustice, trauma, harm that's happening, that has been done to communities. And so it can be pretty heavy, but it's so important to realize that there's so much joy, there's so much fun to be had in this work, and that helps make it feel really meaningful. And so that's, something that I think is really important as well, to think about how you're working with the people that you have relationships with, and, having some fun and finding joy along the way. So I will stop sharing. That's my little screen. I'm hoping that it's no longer sharing there.
Great. Yeah,
I will pass it along. Thanks.
thank you, Sarah. Those are fantastic opening comments. Yeah, I really hear you about positionality, about how you can sometimes take on the burden of collaborators in the work. Love the comment about joy. And the only very clear don't I read was, or I see, was don't be annoying, which is probably covers a lot of ground. So I'm going to pass it on to Kevin Fitzmaurice from the Chanie Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies at Trent University. As an ally scholar, Dr. Fitzmaurice has experience in Indigenous research, co-leadership, teaching, course development, and university administration. He's an associate professor at Trent and professor emeritus. I loved it when I saw this line, Kevin, with the University of Sudbury, Laurentian. I thought, can we of our age be professor emeritus? But I know there's a story there that we won't get into today.
Thank you, Peter. Don't get me started.
Let's pass it on to Kevin to share his insights on collaborative do's and don'ts.
Okay, thank you. I will stay clear of the Professor Emeritus designation. Okay, so Ani Bojo, Kevin Fitzmaurice, Indigenous, in Swakamak and Donjiba, Jaganash, Nuiji, Mitsimamag, Anishinaabe, Nini, and Dao. So I just want to, I put my intro in the chat, but just to reiterate that I'm in the Robinson Huron Treaty area. I'm in Sudbury, in Swakamak. I've also identified myself as a non-Indigenous white person that walks with the Anishinaabe as an ally scholar. And so the way I've organized this and the way I kind of thought to talk about it, it is only 5 minutes. So I'm gonna really try hard not to be annoying because it is a hazard. It is a hazard of mine. But I'm going to just briefly talk about just some of the literature really quickly. I have a few points. I have slides, but I don't really need to share them. I'm just going to go through the points. And then I want to get to my my own experiences with Indigenous community-driven research over the years as an ally scholar. And I want to acknowledge David Newhouse here, who I was mentioning earlier in the smaller group that David actually was my supervisor almost 25 years ago. And I've been working with David in various Indigenous community-driven research projects over the years. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. I'm going to talk about long-term relationships. And in many ways, Sarah, I really want to thank you for your opening. I'm going to be echoing much of what Sarah has already talked about in a maybe in a specific way in terms of my own work. So just some of the themes around allyship as non-Indigenous people working to become allies and working closely in relationship with Indigenous people, Indigenous organizations, Indigenous communities. Some of the major themes that I'm certainly seeing and I've contributed to over the years too is the helping to assemble diverse research governance committees. So helping in that process towards the privileging of action, the privileging of putting research into practice, and so including community practitioners within research committees with community partners. And so creating diverse communities and privileging action. Of course, relationship building, respectful listening, and also learning and unlearning is a really, really important part. And we can talk about these points as we move along in this talk. Amplifying Indigenous voices and making and holding space are some of the really important themes within allyship and allyship research. Working towards the truth and reconciliation, supporting Indigenous self-determination, resurgence, and indigenization, addressing racism in all of its manifestations, systemic, structural, institutional, microaggressions, and working to unlearn settler consciousness. Decentering whiteness, making it visible, and addressing white fragility, having difficult conversations and interrogating privilege, and sharing power and committing to transformation, personal transformation and large-scale social transformation. And so in my own experience, and which in many ways complements some of these themes within the literature. I'm just highlighting and echoing what Sarah was talking about in terms of being a good friend. And the idea of being in a relationship, and then Sarah, you talked about moving away from transactional type of relationships. So being in a relationship, being a friend, not coming to research with pre-existing agendas. Not working in hierarchical ways. And so working things out together, being an interested party, right? Building community, understanding one's interests as shared and interconnected, as you would a friend, right? And so working to converge your interests and pursuing them together. And so that speaks to a particular kind of bravery and honesty about what your interests are, right? And how we are conditioned within this overarching context of settler colonialism and working within settler colonial institutions. And so being open, being honest about your interests around career, publications, authorship, and advancement, and working to build relationships which are complementary rather than zero-sum game. And so and again, echoing Sarah, and this is certainly the way in which I've been supported along the ways, is to know and honor who you are and to be yourself. And again, that requires bravery and honesty and understanding one's settler colonial conditioning, which can in many cases be away from collaboration and sharing, right? And so understanding oneself as a treaty partner on unceded, and in my context, Anishinaabe land, working with Indigenous people towards mutual benefit as a part of redressing colonial harms. And this is also really important, and we can speak to this at many different levels, particularly in relation to all of creation. But within the context of research and allyship is finding one's place, finding your place in the process, and then knowing your place as a practice of humility. And again, to speak to Sarah's comments, without being annoying about it, do the work, know your place. And within an overarching context, and this has been part of all of the work that I've been involved with, within an overarching context of helpfulness and usefulness for both yourself as well as for others. And so just a couple more points. To be accountable, to commit to a long-term process, to support and to not lead action, unless, and this happens, and this has happened, unless that is the support that your partners determine for you. And so sometimes that's also required. So to lead through service, consensus building, and the building and maintaining of trusting relations, or simply getting out of the way, which can also be required. And that's fine, And so this building, and then the last just thing I wanted to focus on, and I think if I was going to, if I had to distill this down into something, I would focus it in on, and this is really where my thinking is going, is the building and maintaining of trust, because I think that's central and core to this, and I think it's really something to aspire to in all of your relations, really, but particularly in an Indigenous settler context and Indigenous community-driven relations. And so it's to apply a two-eyed seeing approach to apply the work of Elder Albert Marshall, and as well as to apply particular teachings of Elder Michael Thrasher, who I've worked with over many years now. And that is to take the time to build that trust. So he talks about it in terms of the 1,000 cups of tea that's required, or coffee for David and I, 1,000 cups of coffee over the years. And it's that relationship building and that time to develop trust is preceded by a foundation of respect and the acceptance of who we are in our diversities, and the desire to bring, and this is Albert Marshall's two-eyed seeing. I just actually heard him talk about this last week again, and he added something more to it. And it's this idea of bringing diverse perspectives and knowledges to the question or to the issue at hand. And for two things: to get the most accurate and most useful understanding of the question or issue, but also to do the least amount of harm, because everybody's at the table, everybody's looking. And so with respect then and relationships over time, it builds empathy, which moves us towards caring behavior for each other. To bring it back to Michael and his particular four-directional teachings. And so, and then I just wanted to talk about some of the teaching of Lorne Bob and Majijuan, who I've worked with most recently, and this is the last thing I'll say, is just that this then working in these ways together, it opens us up to each other. And it supports, in my view, it supports the creation of what Willie Ermine describes as ethical spaces. And it includes, and it comes with feelings of vulnerability, but also feelings of safety. And it moves, I think, in a meaningful way, Indigenous research methods, which there's been much written about, Indigenous research methods towards those 4 R's of respect, reciprocity, relevance, and responsibility. And with specific reference to Lorne Bob and Majijuan, it happens, it can still happen, and it needs to happen, according to them, in a way that speaks to Aniwana, or the overarching ethic of non-interference. And within Miigwech, as a ceremonial concept of giving and receiving. And that, to me, connects very closely to Wilson's text on research as ceremony, but also, and this is something, as again, much of this is always like a work in progress, right? It's a thinking out loud of De Buywen, is my understandings of De Buywen around the sharing of heart knowledge. And so that's what I would like to share today. And I think I'd love to, I think Sarah was talking about this earlier, like decentering myself in this and opening this up to a much broader discussion.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. A lot of wise words there. Something I mentioned to the panelists before everybody else came in, but I think is worth, just wanted to bring it up again, because it's been really important for me to learn principles of Indigenous research, how to do research well with Indigenous peoples. I've found it's such a gratifying process for myself personally and professionally. And many of the principles I've learned apply to research in general with all kinds of groups and populations. It's about treating the people we work with not as objects of our research, but as subjects, as agents in their own lives, and how can we work with and support their agency in the work that we do. I also really appreciate, Kevin, that you mentioned on the one hand, prioritize action in the work to make it relevant to our partners, but then also be honest that like maybe you need to get some publications out of the partnership, right? Put that on the table. It's like, you may need community action on housing and I need a few lines on my CV, and then we can keep working together, right? So not hide or ignore those professional needs we may have as university researchers, but really put it on the table for discussion and dialogue. Okay, so, Kevin, just quickly, I wonder if there was a question, maybe just for clarification, white fragility. How would you sum that up in a sentence or two?
I would maybe in another word, I would say colorblind, just like not wanting to talk about this. It's too upsetting, not wanting to have those difficult conversations about how white people are privileged and empowered within settler colonial contexts and white supremacy contexts. It's not having those difficult conversations.
Thanks, Kevin. And of course, if other questions have come up from these presentations, we're going to open it up for Q&A shortly. But first, we have 2 discussants to introduce. The first is Elie Azar, my colleague from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Carleton University. Elie Azar is a Canada Research Chair and Associate Professor in that department. He's a co-investigator on the Safe and Affordable project and serves on its National Steering Committee and leads the Climate Impacts and Mitigation theme. Dr. Azar's research focuses on enhancing the performance of buildings and communities by advancing and integrating building simulation tools, including physics-based and data-driven models. Maybe I'll leave it there and Elie, pass it on to you to just reflect on what you've been hearing. I know, well, you've mentioned when I brought you into this conversation, that partnership-based research is not typically your wheelhouse, but here you are in a partnership-based project, and I'm curious what you're hearing and how it does relate to what you have been doing over the years.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Peter. And yes, I remember when you sent me the email, the first thing I asked you, like, am I the right person to be here and talking about this topic from the lens of engineering and buildings, right? So first, a bit more clarification on what I do in my research chair appointment is, yes, we study building performance. We study things like energy consumption, carbon emissions, the traditional building performance metrics, but we also expand beyond this. So first, we understand that buildings are designed for people to live in, to work in, to be comfortable and happy in. So buildings need to be adapted for the individuals. And also with things like climate change and how we have more and more stressors on our built environment, that will have significant impacts on buildings and on people as well. So part of our research efforts are to prepare buildings and people for future weather conditions so that they are more human-centric and more safe and also affordable. So because of this human element, now we see a big overlap between things like designing buildings to be just good and also co-designing the buildings with the people who will live in those buildings. So part of the safe and affordable project is to evaluate the performance of the buildings and also understand if they are providing people what they need to be providing them, and also look at how we can improve building design and building performance to be more focused and catered to buildings. So I think this is the answer to your question, Peter, a bit this overlap. Because we are designing buildings for people, then we need to be engaging with people, getting this two-way interaction so that we can design the best possible buildings. So that being said, I noticed some challenges that come with this objective of ours, and I think Sarah alluded to some things like taking time to develop those relationships, taking time to really help co-design some of the solutions that we will be exploring. And this is often a bit challenging in the engineering context because we are developing research tools, research methods. Yes, we have sometimes, some applications. We need to apply those research methods to some to actual buildings and communities, but that gives us a very little time to develop those relationships. So because we don't start, as opposed to, for example, social scientists, who from day one, they are working with their communities. In our case, we develop methods, techniques, and then we want to apply those methods. But then obviously we don't want to be imposing any solutions. We need to really emphasize co-design. And that's, I think, one of the challenges pertaining particular to our research field when it comes to taking the time to develop the relationships so that we can have some proper co-design applications and co-design principles respected. Also things, and I think one of in the description of this seminar, there was the data sovereignty topic that was mentioned. Also, I think I'm a little bit struggling with it, and I'd like to hear more. Data sovereignty is easy to handle once you are working with the community, because we could be discussing with the community those needs and see how those could be accounted for. But in our case, we sometimes just go to individual buildings. So one of the research we do is we monitor building performance and try to propose solutions. So we are dealing with individuals as opposed to a community. So some of the things like data sovereignty become, even co-design, become a bit challenging for us because we're not working with a unified community, but rather individuals on a case-by-case basis. So I think I'll stop here. Maybe we could discuss those challenges, and I could chime in again if I have something useful, obviously, to add. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Elie, for just explaining some of your research and then how the kinds of principles and approaches that have been raised by Sarah and Kevin can come into play, but also the questions that arise really about what does co-design look like in this context? What does accountability look like in this context? What does data sovereignty look like? I've also experienced that challenge of working with individuals or small groups within a community, and then how do we understand data sovereignty, which is also often related to the nation or a larger entity that would want to have the sovereignty over the work. Yeah, these are important questions that are coming up. and we'll bring them back. But first, I want to introduce our second discussant, and then we'll bring back your questions, Elie, to kind of have all four of you weigh in and others as well. David Newhouse is from the Chanie Wenjack School for Indigenous Studies at Trent University. Same place that Kevin is based academically right now. David is Onondaga from the Six Nations of the Grand River community near Brantford, Ontario. He's a professor of Indigenous Studies. He's chair of the Chanie Wenjack School, was the first principal of the Peter Zosky College at Trent University. And I think I'm just going to pass it over to David. And he's got a great taste in clothing. That's that's where I started in my private conversation with him at the beginning of the day. And it's still there in the that he's wearing on his head.
My hat. The earliest picture I have of me is wearing a hat. So, and so that was, I guess I was 6 at the time, so that was 65 years ago. So it's quite the challenge. So there's something to say about consistency, right? But I want to thank first of all, both Sarah and Kevin for their comments, because I think the principles and observations that they brought to the table are consistent with what I see as an Indigenous research paradigm that has emerged or is in the process of emerging over the past couple of decades or so. So it's good to see that these ideas have gone beyond Indigenous studies and are moving into other areas as well, because I think they're solid foundational principles for all good research, whether it's decolonial or whether it's community-based or whether it is simply standard social science research as well. But I want to start also by telling you a story. I served as a reviewer for the Cura research competitions back in the mid-90s. I guess that's the last century or so. And the Cura was short for Community University Research Alliance. And it was a short program. And they invited universities to hold together collaborative research groups who then apply for funding. And the committee I was part of was tasked with reviewing these and making recommendations on which should be funded. And at the end of the first competition, we had a debrief, and one member of the committee said that he was very dissatisfied with the partnerships and the alliances that were presented by the research applicants, and with the exception, he said, of the Indigenous ones. And he felt that the Indigenous research proposals provided evidence of, as he said, real partnerships, real collaborative efforts. And I was intrigued, and it's taken me 25 years to find an answer to that question. And so part of the answer is in what Kevin and Sarah have spoken about today. The other part, I think, has to do with worldview and ethics. And and in trying to answer the question, and I went back, I was asked to talk to a business class about Indigenous knowledge and business. And I chose to focus the conversation on collaboration. And I started with the story of Sky Woman that I grew up with. I grew up in the Haudenosaunee community at Six Nations Grand River. I was part of the Longhouse. I was part of the Confederacy of Chiefs. And so I grew up in that what we would now call a traditional environment. And so we learned the story of the Sky Woman and the creation of this world. And as I began to think about it, it's a foundational story for Haudenosaunee people because it sets out the ethical framework by which we are to live and work. And in the story, right, a woman is falling from the sky, from a world above us. And as she's falling, the animals who are on the earth below us, and the earth is covered with water, begin to wonder who she is, begin to wonder what she is. And they finally convince themselves that she is in fact a human being. And so they decide they need to find a place for her to land. And the turtle offers he's back. And but there's no earth. And so the birds fly up and they create a platform to lower her down. And then the animals, one by one, go into the water, gather, and all of them are unsuccessful except for the last one, who was a muskrat. He comes back with a piece of earth and places onto her back, and then they lower the woman onto the back, and then she dances the world into existence. This is a story about collaboration, and a story about working together, and it's a story about and a story that we tell ourselves about how we ought to work together. That knowledge creation, that creation of the world, is in fact a collaborative effort. Right? In this case, is the collaboration between the animals and human beings and the spirit world. And so built into Indigenous cultures right around the world is this idea of collaboration. And I'm using Haudenosaunee culture as a stand-in for all Indigenous cultures. And that may not entirely be true, but most of them, I think, have the same sort of story as well. And so it makes sense then that the proponents who brought forward those proposals reflected that idea of working together because they had well-developed structures for working together. As Sarah talks about governance structures, they had ethics of mutual benefit. They we're in this together, but we all need something to get out of it. We're all in it. And it's also about power sharing. Right? We forget, right, that research has been conducted in an environment of unequal power. And so when you begin to focus upon collaborative research, right, you're beginning to share power. And we're beginning to bring diverse perspectives together. And Albert Marshall, right, taught us how to do that, right, in an atmosphere of co-learning. And I think that's extremely important, right? That research then becomes this ethical site and the site of co-learning and the site of power sharing. And that frame leads to the practical actions that Kevin and Sarah spoke about. And so what I always think important as we begin to think about collaboration, that we go back and think about what exactly does that mean, right? How are we going to demonstrate that we're cooperating? How are we going to demonstrate that we're sharing power, right? And often I think, and just one, I'm going to stop here, often one area that is overlooked is the area of interpretation. We've got the data, we collect the data, and then what does the data mean? How do we interpret the data? And often that is left to the researchers, right, who come from the academy. And what I found is that if the communities that we're involved with are also engaged in the interpretation of the results, the meaning making, that is an important outcome of research, then the end result is much, much stronger and is much more likely to be supported, right, as well. And so right, we often forget about that as a site of collaboration, because they will have what my cultural studies colleagues call vernacular theories as to how that data should be interpreted. So I'm going to stop there, and I thank both Sarah and Kevin for their, I guess, for setting out both the ethics and the actions that are important for collaborative research as well. And I hope I talked a bit about some of the frameworks that hopefully will help us to understand why we're doing things in this particular fashion. Okay, so thanks, Peter. Hopefully that helps a bit.
Yahweh, David, thank you. Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of beautiful stuff that you presented, including the Sky Woman story. And I really just want to pick up on this last point about, because it's a very practical thing that I think researchers in so many fields can do. Yes, in principle, community-based research and community-driven research is designed from the front end with community partners. But even in cases where that is not the case, when it comes to data interpretation if you're working with partners, it's such a perfect opportunity to do a presentation on interim results and then have a discussion about, what do you think this means? What does this mean to you? And it will, because there's going to be so many different perspectives, as you say, that vernacular knowledge, the tacit knowledge that people who live in housing or that use housing or that maintain housing or whatever will bring in perspectives that we as the researchers may not have been thinking about, right? And so it's a much, and they will also, like, we may say, we think it means this, and somebody say, you can't put it that way, or that's not going to land, because this is also not just for, the NGOs or communities that we work with, but also when we're doing policy relevant research, to bring people who work in that policy environment into the discussion to say, if we frame our results this way, is that meaningful to you? And they may say no, but if you do it this way, you may actually achieve the results you're looking for. I would love to, I know David has to go in a few minutes, so I'm going to bring him, make sure he has a chance to speak again before 1:30. But I just wanted to bring the question that Elie brought forward to any of the other panelists here today. And it's the question of maybe to speak just a little bit about data sovereignty in Indigenous context particularly. And have you had experience where, like, trying to understand what that means if you're working with an individual or a small group within a community? Like, how do we kind of work through questions of data sovereignty? And maybe I'll also give a bit larger container for this conversation by pointing people, and I'll put it in the chat afterwards, the principles of OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession of data, which is kind of a broader framework within which the data sovereignty question comes up. Do either David, Sarah, or Kevin want to touch on this question of data sovereignty?
No, that's a long conversation, Peter, but I have to go, unfortunately, right as well. But it's all about power and sharing power.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah. And thus, like, it's not for the university researcher to figure out what it means, right? It's to be negotiated, discussed.
That's right.
With an understanding of where the ownership really has to lie. Yeah. Thank you. And Sarah, thank you for being with us, David, and good luck with your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Do either Sarah or Kevin want to speak to this?
Maybe, Sarah, I might just say that in terms of OCAP or the emerging care principles around data sovereignty, I agree with David. It is a long conversation, and it is an emerging conversation. And the only thing I might say is that it starts with the assumption that ownership, control, access, and possession rests with the Indigenous community, rests with the Indigenous partner, rests with the Indigenous participant, and then it is a negotiated process of what does that mean to you, and how do we make this work together, right? And the conversation then, I think, should should, if it isn't happening already, should be initiated by the researcher. Like, here is the framework in which we're working. How do we understand these things, and how do we make them work for you? You know, and then there can be incredible diversity there, depending on who you're working with.
Great, thank you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and so I welcome, there's still 35 folks out there, so if anybody wants to raise any questions or have comments, or you're welcome to put something in the chat and I will read it out, or welcome to raise your hand and join the conversation here. Jackie Elie, go ahead. Maybe I'll take, 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll just kind of pass it around speakers and to see who wants to speak to what.
Sure. It took me quite a while to figure out how to raise my hand there on Zoom. Such a lovely panel. Thank you so much, Peter, and I know your RA as well, and maybe Jen was involved in pulling this together. It's fantastic. I have questions, but I think what I will say, just regarding the last point that we were discussing, that David raised about collaborative interpretation of data findings, and very pragmatically to remind the researchers who are involved with Safe and Affordable that this would be a fantastic way to work with our advisory committees. For instance, if you don't have access to your community respondents in a way that's practical, we have an Indigenous advisory, we have a First Voice advisory, we have an international advisory. They play a slightly different role, but those groups are part of the project for precisely this reason, so that those voices are integrated into the project, and interpreting data is later. We don't want to wait that long, but for instance, with the engineers, to bring some of your findings to those committees and get their feedback and thoughts on it. So that's what I'll say. I've got questions, but.
Great, thank you, Jackie. I might also add, because I know there's a bunch of grad students here who are even thinking about their own research projects and whatever, and I always emphasize to my students, like, though it may feel awkward, going to speak with people who actually work in the field that you have a research question about, to hear how that resonates or not with them is like, this is just good practice for getting research questions that are meaningful. And then, and then maybe that person or those people can also serve in some kind of advisory capacity. Like, if you're not part of a big project with these structures like the Safe and Affordable has, there's other ways to kind of live this out in a way that makes your can make your research results stronger, more impactful. Yeah, so it's good practice, but it takes some bravery to because imposter syndrome shows up when you go out to the community and say, I'm doing research, but I don't really know what I'm doing, and I'd love your help. Courtney, I'll pass it to you.
Hi, thanks, Peter, and thank you, everybody. My name is Courtney. I'm a postdoc researcher with the University of Calgary. So just kind of starting on my journey of doing community research, did some community research with my dissertation and my PhD, but definitely, of course, looking back, those of us who've done PhDs, I'm not sure if you feel it, but you look back and you go, I should have done this, and I should have done that, and I should have done that. So just always kind of on that journey of learning. And so thank you so much for being so candid with the do's and don'ts. They're super practical. One thing I was going to touch on was, like in those starting of the partnerships, and Peter, you just kind of mentioned it. I've just basically kind of been doing that cold calling type approach. And sometimes it's difficult to step outside of the structures that we're involved in. We want to have frameworks, we want to have rules, we want to have those kinds of organized ways of going about it. But my first question is, yeah, like when you're starting those relationships, I find, you know, you build the relationships, and sometimes with, especially in some of the nonprofit organizations with homelessness and housing, there's so much turnover. And so sometimes you lose the people that are in the actual organizations. And have you experienced that? How have you managed that is one question. And the other question is, you know, managing those larger structures that haven't quite got there, that, you know, we have to report to, like our funding agencies and meeting our, you know, demands for publications and those kinds of things, how you manage the time while also respecting the burden of work that we might be putting on community partners. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Yeah, all really insightful comments, Courtney. I'll just see if there's any others. I know that there were some questions raised in the chat about this safe and affordable project specifically, but I think Jackie's responded to that one in the chat. Remy Kusimo, would you like me to read this out, or you're also welcome to raise to come on screen?
Thank you,
Okay, I will.
Peter. So we are hearing a lot with our community partners about how they want more action-oriented research. They're tired of just doing research. Why not do more actions, especially with the cold winter upon us and homelessness being right in our faces? So I wonder if you have some practical examples to share on how you would do this to actually build that trust that we care and that we want to be part of the solution, because it would take longer to come to all of our research reports and finally impacting on policy changes. But what do we do in the now so that they don't feel like we're just interested in the research? Yeah.
Great, thank you, Remy. And maybe I'll turn it now to Sarah or Elie or Kevin to respond to either what you're hearing from Courtney or Remy. And from Remy, my intuition is that part of the answer is that, but I'd like to hear from the researchers here on the table, you know, about sometimes there's ways that we can add bits into the project that allow for quicker kind of knowledge mobilization, if you will, than waiting to the end of the project. And that can, I'm seeing some nods, so I'm just going to pass it over maybe to Sarah first to
Sure. Well, those were all some great questions. There was, okay, so maybe starting with that sort of, you know, community partners, their work is all about trying to make an impact and address needs right away. And I think, I don't know, like, but I think maybe just talking to partners and saying like, well, what is it that we could do to help? Like, where could a research perspective help? And, you know, I think all of this, like, there aren't actually any like easy answers, but maybe I know that, you know, in my experience in the past, you know, Chantel, who had to leave the meeting, but Chantel and I have, you know, written an op-ed together that gets, you know, published in the paper about whatever issue it is that we're working on, legal aid or access to justice, whether or not that leads to help, but then it may, you know, add to the public discourse and discussion. We also have, you know, built relationships. Like, I think it also depends on, I think communities are all a little bit different. And, you know, we're in Saskatoon, it's a smaller community, and people, there's a lot more, like, there's a lot of relationships. And so we often, you know, with Chantel and I, like, we've been able to, you know, maybe have a meeting with the Minister of Justice to share some of the research that we've been doing. Again, whether that's ever led to any actual impact is questionable, because our government sometimes isn't really open to but those are the kinds of things that are sometimes the community partners are looking for, that kind of you know, impact. And there are things that researchers can assist with that, like creating a little report for the meeting with the minister, you know, like that kind of thing. So but that said, maybe also there's some assistance or work that can be done that's completely unrelated to the research. Maybe you can go and volunteer at their fundraiser, you know, and like maybe those are things that can be helpful as well. The question about turnover, or like when you're just starting out and don't have those relationships, I think that part of it is just learning or just being okay with being uncomfortable and realizing that it does take time, and you can't immediately be sort of in the middle of all the conversations that are happening. But it's a journey, and you can start those relationships and see what might be helpful, and maybe not again immediately make it about the research or your own sort of needs, but actually find out like, well, what is it that community partners are looking for, and just starting to do that again without taking up everyone's time too much. So I'm thinking about that. I think that turnover, like I think actually just becoming, it's sometimes like I've really found just like accepting invitations in community, like there's a community round dads, there's a community event, there's something happening in the community that's unrelated to your specific research interest or project. But if you become a person who shows up and gets to know people over time, that is actually, it can help facilitate good research down the road. And in terms of the tension between publications and like university demands and what the community is looking for, I think we talked about that a little bit earlier, but there is some negotiation. I know with my work with the legal clinic, like they're very aware of how the university operates, and that I need to get some sort of peer-reviewed publication, you know, eventually out of this thing. And they're like actually like really like I get a lot of support because it's reciprocity, like this idea of like, you know, and they're you know, ideally the thing that gets published eventually is something that's, you know, helpful also to their work as well. But I don't know if that's helpful.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So I'm conscious that we're coming down to the last 5 minutes. Elie, is it a do you want to respond to some of what's been said, or is it a comment or a
just
question?
two quick comments building on Sarah's points. I think you could design your project to have clear deliverables throughout that don't need necessarily to be the traditional deliverables. So we've had some projects where we would just share the results of the survey that we ran with our partner, or just give them a small Excel spreadsheet that is, you know, showing the main data that we're working on and how they relate to each other. So just if they feel that they're engaged and they're receiving some updates from you, whether tools or articles or other, and then usually that reduces a little bit the stress to just wait till the end to get the final project. And the second point also related to publications, and that Sarah also mentioned, often even if you're working on a research article, you could have like a small version of that article as a LinkedIn post, you know, or as another or like a flyer or a small article in another venue. But that would be summarizing this research. So giving some resources for your stakeholders, cater to them in a shorter format while you're still getting your publications out, which are of course needed. So yeah, I'll stop there given the interest of time. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Elie. I would like to invite either Jen or Sandos. There it is. So there's a feedback form in the chat that I would just ask people to click on, and it will continue to be on your web browser after this closes in a few minutes. Please do send it back to us. Particularly, we welcome your reflections on today, and then any suggestions for further topics or speakers that you would like to hear from. We do plan to do another collaborative do's and don'ts. Maybe that'll become the series title in February, and then again I think next spring. So welcome your thoughts on that. Barbara, we still have a few minutes if you want to just get your question or comment in, and then I'm going to have sort of 1 minute for each of our speakers kind of with any wrap-up comments. Nice to see you, Barbara.
Yeah, well, thank you. First, thanks to the panelists. It was really, really interesting conversation. And as you've said, Peter, to be continued. Multi-faith housing is an organization that I and a couple of my fellow volunteers are on this call are involved with. And one of the issues that we're facing right now is, in fact, not so much a collaborative partnership. It's sort of it's also not a hostile partnership, but we are in a large affordable housing initiative with the private sector. We are the mouse in this relationship with an elephant. And I just wondered if, based on the experience of any of the people on the call, whether any specific advice, principle, I think certainly all of the principles that we've talked about so far are really applicable to the situation that we're in with private sector, but anything else perhaps that we need to bear in mind in terms of how to proceed around issues of research and evaluation with the private sector. And maybe it's Dr. Azar who would have the most to tell us, but I'd love to hear from others around the table too.
Thanks, Barbara. I don't know how deeply we can get into this, but I'll give each of our speakers kind of a minute to wrap up, and that'll take us just over the 1:45 mark. So if anybody has to go, thank you for being here with us today, and we'll be wrapping up shortly. Maybe I'll go to Elie first, and then Sarah, and then Kevin to wrap up.
Yeah, I think, Barbara, we could continue the discussion offline.
Sure.
I'm not sure I have the answers to your questions, but we can definitely discuss a bit more. Yeah, I mean, to wrap up within 2 minutes for everyone. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you again, Peter, and thank everyone for this participation. I think this is good for us engineers who are often caught up with our research methods and modeling and data analysis to take a bit of step back and think of how is our research impacting people and how we can learn from people to make the solutions more adapted to them and more beneficial. So yeah, I would stop here. Thank you again for everyone, and I'd be happy to continue the discussions offline.
Thank you, Elie, and thanks for offering to connect with Barbara. Maybe you guys can just sort of through the chat get each other's connection. And over to you, Sarah.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to be here. I think I've been reflecting the whole time on wishing that everyone who was here today could share their stories and tips and do's and don'ts and experiences. So I acknowledge that, that there's so much experience in the room here, and hopefully we'll have chances to share that knowledge in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And just as a point, as you fill out that application form, if you are indeed one of those people who's been itching to kind of let us know, and you might be on deck the next time around. Kevin, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Peter, and thank you everyone for having me here and participating in this conversation. It's been excellent, Peter. Thank you and your team for organizing this. Just a couple of points for students just starting out. I think the recommendation that I would make is to align yourself with a research center at your university or a faculty member that you know that is involved in this kind of work. And then working with them will open up a whole, community of relationships for you, and then work really hard, work really hard with them, In terms of turnover in different agencies, one of the and impact and action, one of the things that I find really effective is both engaging, like saying yes to things, and being on community organizational boards, being on response committees at various levels, either with the city or some of the social service organizations, and doing that type of volunteer work in the community. I find because even in large urban centers, often communities are quite small, and quickly your reputation will quickly be shared among the workers. The last thing I wanted to say is in terms of the very last comments on working with community partners as a mouse and not having a voice or sway within certain particular contexts, I think all I would say there, and I've had experience with this too, is know when to resign, know when to disengage from particular partnerships, and know when your work is being appropriated in ways that you disagree with. And that happens too. And so I think it's really important to also have boundaries, really important boundaries, and to know what they are. And again, it goes back to what Sarah was saying around knowing yourself and knowing, you know, what it is that you can do and what it is you don't want to do. And so that's all I would say there. Thank you. Thanks again so much.
Thank you, Kevin. One last thing to offer Barbara is one may perceive that one is the mouse in relation to the elephant, but sometimes the elephant needs you, right? Sometimes the elephant may want to announce to their board or to their funders or their private sector partners or whatever, how that they're working with organizations like yours. And so it may actually give you some power to, you know, demand some accountability you know, if you really want to be working with us, this is what it looks like. And we need to have this kind of communication in our relationship and so on. And so, you know, and if you don't get that, as Kevin says, it might be time to pull the plug. But you can just see what power you have by making your needs really clearly known. I just want to thank our speakers again, David and Elie and Sarah and Kevin. I'd like to thank our funders, SSHRC and CMHC. Thank Jackie and Jerry and Liam and the team at the Safe and Affordable Housing Project. Thanks to Sandoz Katate for organizing this webinar and future ones, and Jen Harrison from the Carleton Center for Community Innovation for really making all of this work in the background. And like I say, please fill out the evaluation form. We'll take your comments seriously, and we look forward to, there'll be more in the webinar series from the Safe and Affordable Housing Project specifically. We'll make sure you all are on that list to hear about it. And then we'll reconvene this conversation at some point in February with another slate of excellent speakers. So thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon.